My name is Lauren Price. I'm a networking specialist customer engineer at Google Cloud, and today I'm going to talk to you about the networking concepts for cloud data fusion that are helpful to know for implementation, security, and connectivity. Cloud Data Fusion is Google Cloud's native managed service for enterprise data integration and ingestion. It provides a visual point-and-click interface, enabling a code-free deployment of ETL and ELT data pipelines. Cloud Data Fusion has a number of components that exist behind the scenes that power the service, and it creates a tenant project and VPC to hold those resources. The Data Fusion components that are surfaced to the user are the Data Fusion instance and the Dataproc clusters. Each Cloud Data Fusion instance contains a unique, independent Cloud Data Fusion deployment that contains a set of services that handle pipeline lifecycle management, orchestration, coordination, and metadata management. Cloud Data Fusion creates ephemeral execution environments to run pipelines when you manually run your pipelines or when pipelines run through a time schedule or a pipeline state trigger. Cloud Data Fusion uses Dataproc as an execution environment in which you can choose to run pipelines as Spark or Spark streaming programs. Cloud Data Fusion provisions an ephemeral Dataproc cluster in the user project at the beginning of a pipeline run, executes the pipeline using MapReduce or Spark in the cluster, and then deletes the cluster after the pipeline execution is complete. Alternatively, if you manage your Dataproc clusters in controlled environments, you can also configure Cloud Data Fusion not to provision ephemeral clusters and run pipelines against existing Dataproc clusters instead. The Cloud Data Fusion instance can be thought of as the design environment and the Dataproc cluster as the execution environment. There are two types of Cloud Data Fusion instances based on an access model: a public instance, which is the default deployment, and a private instance. Let's dig into the access patterns from different scenarios. We can start with the public IP deployment pattern. In a public instance, network communication happens over the open internet, regardless of the source location, which is not recommended for critical environments. The Cloud Data Fusion instance for the design environment will have a public IP. However, the Dataproc cluster used for the execution environment can be deployed with either public IP or private IPs. Let's move on to the private IP deployment pattern. Cloud Data Fusion private IP has different setup steps depending on whether you are using a standard VPC or a shared VPC network. If you're using a standard VPC, you can create the instance using either the Cloud Console or a curl command. However, if you are using a shared VPC, you must use a curl command. Check out the documentation that's linked in the description for more information. When private IP instances are created, a separate tenant project is created for each user project in which Cloud Data Fusion instances are provisioned. Additionally, Cloud Data Fusion private IP requires a peering connection to communicate privately with sources located in the user VPC and is required for the design environment capabilities. This peering connection must be created manually. If you need to access a public source using a private IP Cloud Data Fusion instance when designing pipelines, you must use version 6.4 or above. In the design environment, Cloud Data Fusion traffic will traverse a VPC peer from the tenant VPC to the user VPC. Traffic will then be directed to an internal load balancer fronting a managed instance group of gateway VMs. Traffic will egress through the gateway VMs through a cloud NAT configured for the subnet and to the public source on the internet. The Dataproc cluster used for the execution environment should be configured to egress through the cloud NAT as well to reach the public source. For sources that are hosted within the user VPC, Cloud Data Fusion will connect over a VPC peer. Firewalls must be configured in the source VPC to allow the source to communicate with the Cloud Data Fusion instance, as well as the Dataproc execution environment. If you are in a peered hub-and-spoke architecture model and you are trying to make a connection from a VPC that is not directly peered to the Cloud Data Fusion tenant VPC, you must use a proxy due to the non-transitive routing nature of Google's VPCs. This will only be needed for the design environment. Be aware you can also replace a peering hub-and-spoke architecture with a VPN hub-and-spoke model so that the Cloud Data Fusion tenant VPC route can be advertised over the VPN. Non-transitive peering also comes into play when trying to connect to a Google Cloud source that is deployed using another tenant project, for example, Cloud SQL. Cloud Data Fusion and Cloud SQL are both hosted in tenant projects, but these projects are different. In order for Cloud Data Fusion to connect to a Cloud SQL source, a proxy VM must be deployed in the user VPC to proxy traffic to the Cloud SQL instance when using the design environment. Since the Dataproc clusters used in the execution environment are hosted in the user VPC, they will be able to connect to Cloud SQL without the use of the proxy. When accessing sources in an on-prem environment with Cloud Data Fusion private IP, a hybrid connection must exist between the user VPC and the on-prem environment. Either an HAVPN or interconnect can be used. Both the IP CIDR range for the tenant VPC where the Cloud Data Fusion instance is hosted, as well as the IP CIDR range of the Dataproc cluster in the user VPC, must be advertised over the hybrid connection, and on-prem firewalls must be configured to accept ingress from these ranges. If the VLAN or VPN lands in another peered VPC, then you'll need to use a proxy to connect the source to the Cloud Data Fusion instance. When accessing data sources, both public and private instances make outgoing calls to Google Cloud APIs using private Google access. Let's briefly cover some security topics. For Cloud Data Fusion versions below 6.5, you can only manage access at an instance level. If you have access to an instance, you have access to all pipelines and metadata in that instance. For version 6.5 and above, you also have the ability to use role-based access control to establish namespace-level isolation within a single Cloud Data Fusion instance. This feature is currently in preview. Pipeline access to data is provided by granting access to the service account, which can be a custom service account that you specify. You must make sure that the service account has proper IAM permissions in place to access any Google Cloud-hosted data sources. For a pipeline execution, you control ingress and egress by setting the appropriate firewall rules on the user VPC on which the pipeline is being executed. Before we wrap up, let's summarize the 3 most important takeaways from today. Cloud Data Fusion exists as a design environment that runs within a tenant project in VPC, and an execution environment that runs as a Dataproc cluster within the user VPC. Cloud Data Fusion can be launched with a public IP or private IP, and VPC peering must manually be configured between the tenant VPC and user VPC for private IP. Firewall rules must be configured to allow connections to and from both the Cloud Data Fusion instance CIDR and the Dataproc CIDR. Thanks for watching, and look out for another video on the concepts of networking for Google Cloud's managed services.